Welcome to this explainer. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in. We're traveling all the way back to the autumn of 333 BC. Now, I want you to picture this. The absolute greatest superpower the ancient world had ever seen suddenly colliding head-on with this young, fiercely ambitious conqueror from a kingdom most people had previously, well, completely underestimated. Today, we are unpacking the Battle of Issus. This was a clash of absolute titans that genuinely shifted the entire course of human history. And look, this isn't just some dry story about numbers and swords, it's a high-stakes psychological thriller. We're going to explore how a brilliantly laid trap, a completely claustrophobic terrain, and literally a single catastrophic moment of panic managed to shatter an ancient, seemingly invincible empire. It is an absolute masterclass in military strategy, and I am so excited to break it all down for you.
And that brings us right to the central question we'll be exploring today. Did a single moment of panic really cost a king his entire empire? Well, to understand how that could happen, we have to look at the massive, unprecedented stakes here. Alexander the Great, the 21-year-old king of Macedon, had just launched a ridiculously brazen invasion into the sprawling Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire. He'd won an early victory at the river Granicus, and since then, Alexander had just been marching relentlessly down the coast of Asia Minor. He was a long way from home, deep in hostile territory. Then, on the other side of the board, you have King Darius III, the great king of Persia. He had gathered this imperial army of a scale you just didn't see back then, marching out from Babylon, totally determined to crush this upstart Greek coalition once and for all. Make no mistake, this wasn't a little border skirmish, this was a brutal, existential fight for survival where whoever lost absolutely everything.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the trap at Issus, examine a claustrophobic battlefield, and break down the first strike. Then we'll look at how the tides of war turned, the climactic flight of the king, and finally, the fall of an empire. Let's get started.
Section 1. The Trap at Issus, a king cut off. Here's the thing about this campaign. Alexander actually thought he was the one doing the hunting. He'd been marching his armies south along the Mediterranean coast, totally believing Darius was just waiting for him on some open plain further east. But Darius, he pulled off this brilliantly stealthy strategic maneuver. While Alexander was marching south, Darius quietly marched his massive army north, slipping through a hidden mountain pass called the Ammonic Gates, and essentially sneaked right behind the Macedonian army. Darius descended on the town of Issus, captured it, and completely severed Alexander's supply lines and his only communication route back to Greece. Imagine the shock. Suddenly, Alexander is completely cut off. When word finally reaches him that he's trapped in hostile territory with absolutely no way home, he doesn't panic. He immediately halts his southward march, turns his entire army around, and marches right back north. He knew, and honestly, every single soldier in his ranks knew, that their only way out was to win. There was no retreat, no surrender, no negotiating their way out of this. The alternative was a bitter, desperate fight to the death.
Moving to Section 2, a claustrophobic battlefield, geography as a weapon.
Now, if Darius made even a single strategic error in that amazing flanking maneuver, it was definitely the location he chose to wait for Alexander. The plain of Issus was basically a geographic bottleneck. Paint a picture in your mind for a second. You've got the towering, totally impenetrable Amanus Mountains on one side and the unforgiving waves of the Mediterranean Sea right on the other. And slicing right through the middle of this incredibly narrow coastal plain was the Cydnus River, which had these steep, rugged, jagged banks. Now, if they were on an open plain, Darius's numbers would have been completely overwhelming. He commanded this vast imperial army, realistically somewhere between 60,000 and well over 100,000 men. This included the legendary 10,000 immortals and 30,000 heavily armored Greek mercenaries. This massive force absolutely dwarfed Alexander's 40,000 men, which were centered around the famous Macedonian Phalanx and his elite heavy strike force, the Companion Cavalry. But because they were trapped in this tight, narrow corridor, Darius literally couldn't deploy his men to wrap around and outflank the Macedonians. The geography itself entirely neutralized his greatest advantage.
Even with the terrain playing a factor, Alexander was still outnumbered at least 2-1. But his army was this compact, highly agile war machine. The cramped battlefield took that massive Persian numerical advantage and turned it into a claustrophobic liability. Darius had to stack his men so incredibly deep that the guys in the back ranks couldn't even engage in the fight. They were just stuck there. Alexander saw this instantly. He realized that this narrow plain meant he only had to fight the men standing directly in front of him. He knew his elite veterans had the power to punch right through a concentrated, localized target.
Which brings us to Section 3, the first strike, or as we like to call it, the Macedonian hammer. So the two armies are facing each other across the shallow waters of the Cydnus River. Darius kicks things off with a totally devastating volley. We are talking about a dark storm of thousands of arrows just blotting out the sky, raining down on those tight Macedonian formations. Now, standing still in that situation meant a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. Alexander knew the only answer was aggressive, overwhelming speed. Rather than doing a slow, tactical advance, he personally takes the lead. Positioning himself right at the head of his elite companion cavalry on the right wing, he launches a terrifying, full-speed charge directly across the river, weathering that storm of arrows through sheer, unstoppable momentum. The shock of this was just unfathomable. The heavily armored companions violently smashed right into the lightly armed Persian archers and the infantry behind them. Completely overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of this Macedonian hammer, the Persian left wing broke formation, turned around, and just scattered in absolute chaos.
Section 4. The Tides of War. The Pendulum Swings.
Now, hearing that, it might sound like Alexander had this victory totally secured in the first 5 minutes. But wait, because the pendulum of battle was about to swing violently back the other way. While Alexander had successfully routed the Persian left wing, his center was fighting for bare survival. See, the absolute pride of his army, the Macedonian Phalanx, required flat ground to maintain its impenetrable wall of 18-foot spears. But scrambling up the steep, muddy, bramble-covered banks of the Tarsus River, that completely broke their formation. Dangerous gaps started opening up in their lines, and waiting for them right at the top of that bank were Darius's elite Greek mercenaries. These were heavily armored professionals fighting with shorter spears, which was absolutely perfect for close-quarters combat on uneven terrain. They plunged right into the gaps of the Macedonian line. Suddenly, it became this brutal, bloody slogging match. The Macedonians were taking massive casualties, and they were slowly, terrifyingly being pushed back down into the river.
And believe it or not, the situation was actually even worse over on the Macedonian left wing, the side closest to the sea. Here, Alexander's most trusted veteran general, Parmenion, was making a desperate do-or-die stand. Darius had taken the absolute best of his heavy armored cavalry and massed them on this seaward flank. His goal was to crush the Macedonian left and roll up their entire battle line like a carpet. Parmenion, who was commanding the brilliant Thessalian cavalry, was heavily outnumbered and just absorbing wave after wave of ferocious Persian charges. The stakes here were unimaginable. If Parmenion's line broke, that Persian cavalry would sweep right behind Alexander's army, envelop them, and annihilate every last man. The entire fate of the battle literally hung on Parmenion holding his ground.
Section 5. Flight of the King. The Pivot of Destiny.
So let's look at Alexander's situation. He's just shattered the Persian left wing, but he looks over and realizes his center is bleeding out and his left flank is on the verge of total collapse. Honestly, a lesser commander probably would have just chased the fleeing soldiers right in front of him to secure his own safety. But instead, Alexander executes what is arguably one of the most brilliant tactical pivots in military history. He halts his charging companion cavalry, wheels them 90 degrees to the left, and aggressively drives them straight into the exposed flank and rear of the Persian center. And he's aiming straight for the great king himself. Darius is perched high up in his ornate royal chariot, watching in absolute horror as his invincible royal guard gets cut down by this unstoppable Macedonian wedge. Faced with imminent capture or death, Darius's nerve just completely shatters. Before his massive army was physically defeated, their king psychologically broke. Seeing his flanks falling apart and terrified of being encircled, Darius literally turns his chariot around, abandons his troops, and flees for his life.
You guys, the domino effect of that single decision was just catastrophic. When Alexander struck the center, it finally relieved the intense pressure on his struggling phalanx. Meanwhile, Darius was so terrified by the ferocity of the charge that when the terrain got too rough for his royal chariot, he actually abandoned it, jumped onto a horse, just to escape faster. And the sight of the supreme King of Kings fleeing the battlefield, it rippled through the Persian ranks like an absolute shockwave. Think about it. Why fight and die when your own god king has abandoned you? That incredibly disciplined Persian heavy cavalry, the ones who were this close to breaking Parmenion, they saw the royal standard falling back and immediately lost heart. In a matter of minutes, a highly structured battle line completely collapsed into a chaotic, blind, panicked rout.
Section 6. Fall of an Empire, the Aftermath.
The reality of ancient warfare is that the moment an army breaks, that's when the real slaughter actually begins. I mean, just imagine tens of thousands of terrified men, horses, and chariots all trapped in this narrow bottleneck, desperately trying to funnel backward through tight mountain passes as the sun starts to set.
The casualty numbers tell a really grim story about that retreat. The Macedonian losses were definitely significant due to that fierce fighting in the center, estimated at around 7,000 killed or wounded. But the Persian losses? Utterly catastrophic. They're conservatively estimated at 20,000 dead, and frankly, a lot of ancient sources claim it was way more than that. And the crazy part is, the vast majority of these Persian casualties didn't even happen during hand-to-hand combat. They happened during that chaotic rout, as soldiers were literally trampled to death by their own fleeing cavalry or cut down from behind by the pursuing Macedonians. It is just brutal historical proof that discipline almost always triumphs over sheer numbers.
Now, in his desperate haste to escape, Darius left absolutely everything behind. His immense treasure, his royal robes, and most shockingly, his entire family. His mother, his wife, and his daughters were all captured right there in the Persian camp. But here's where Alexander pulls off a massive geopolitical PR move. He treats the captured royal family with extreme dignity and respect. He was establishing himself not just as this ruthless conqueror, but as a legitimate, merciful ruler. Militarily, this victory at Issus was basically the skeleton key to the east. It completely broke Persian naval dominance because Alexander could now simply march his army down the coast and systematically capture all their naval bases from the land side. Virtually overnight, the entire western half of the Achaemenid Empire was thrown wide open for Macedonian conquest.
So if you take away just one learning from this explainer today, let it be this core concept: discipline over numbers. The Battle of Issus remains an absolute masterclass in military strategy for a reason. It proves that having a massive numerical advantage means absolutely nothing if you cannot deploy it effectively. Alexander utilized that claustrophobic terrain perfectly. He deeply trusted the training and morale of his veteran troops. And most importantly, he recognized the exact right split-second moment to deliver a decapitating psychological strike to the enemy's leadership. I want to leave you guys with a final, somewhat provocative thought to chew on. By winning at Issus, Alexander completely shattered this centuries-old aura of invincibility. What happens to a sprawling, massive empire when a god-king suddenly realizes he can bleed? Sure, Darius III survived the battle that day, but his absolute authority definitely did not. The Achaemenid Empire had stood for centuries as this immovable object, but Issus proved to the whole world that the foundation was cracking. Alexander didn't just win a piece of land that day. He broke the psychological spine of a superpower, totally setting the stage for the dawn of a completely new era in human history. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating moment in time. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.